Hi everyone, and welcome to our wellbeing webinar. My name is Phil Steele. I am Head of Alumni Engagement at the University of Leeds. So it's the job of my team to connect our alumni together and to keep them connected to the university. And we're really pleased to welcome you to today's event. This is part of our big get-together series of activities that's taking place for the whole of this week. The idea with the big get-together, and it's taken a slightly different forms over a number of years, but its aim has always been the same, which is to try and bring everyone together around what we have in common. So wherever we are in the world, what we do have in common is our Leeds experience. And the idea of this series of events is to really kind of celebrate that and bring the community together. If you go onto our website and have a look, you may indeed have done that already, you'll see that there are a number of events taking place right across the world this week, in person, where people are able to meet in person or digitally. And in addition to that, we have run a few events like the one we're doing today, which wherever you are in the world brings everyone together as well. So it's really good already in the chat to sort of see some of the messages from who you are and where you are in the world. And it's great to have our alumni community represented today. So before we sort of pass on to our speaker, just a little bit about how today's event is going to work. There will be time at the end to answer a few questions that you've got. So if you do have any questions that you've got, you can write them down as the presentation goes on. Don't need to wait until the end. If you use the Q&A function that you should be able to see as one of the options on your screen, that would be really good, because that's where we will take the questions from. If you have a look on that Q&A and you see a question that you are particularly interested in, you can kind of vote for that as well. And if a question's got more votes, it goes up the list, and we'll try and prioritize those as well. So both use that function to ask questions, but also have a look at it and do like a question if you're particularly interested in asking it. And we will try to squeeze as many of those questions in towards the end as we can do. And also just to say that this webinar is being recorded. So if for any reason you can't stay till the very end, or indeed if you have friends and colleagues who are Leeds graduates who you think might be interested but weren't able to attend, then we will send the link out to you afterwards as well, so you'll be able to do it again. I'm now delighted to welcome our speaker, Leila Akai, who is founder and CEO of Diverse Minds. Leila graduated from Leeds in 2003, and she founded and is the CEO of Diverse Minds, which helps organisations create mentally healthy and equal workplaces. And that's through training, speaking, and consultancy. And clearly, what that involves and what she's talking about today has particular relevance to us all, I think, and is particularly helpful to us all right now. Leila has more than 17 years' experience in developing and implementing diversity, inclusion, and equality practices, and she's got very strong connections with Leeds. While she was here, she was the welfare officer at Leeds University Union from 2003 to 2004. She was appointed to the University Council in 2018, so she really does have strong connections with the Leeds family, and we are delighted to welcome her today. So I will now hand over to Leila.
Thanks so much, Phil, and thank you for that lovely introduction, and it's an honour to be here. I'm really excited. I know I can't see you all, but it's lovely to see the messages in the chat. So I hope we're going to have a really nice Q&A at the end, but a discussion about wellbeing. What I've done is to try and split it into three parts. So the first part, I'm going to define my perspective on wellbeing, mental health, particularly in relation to the workplace. Then to think about the challenges that COVID has brought, UK focus, but I have put some things in there about different cultures. Even if you're UK based, you might be from several different cultures. And then the third part, to think about, well, what needs to change and what needs to shift. So we're going to explore the term mental health, wellbeing and resilience. I'm going to provide a brief cultural overview to wellbeing approaches based on Hofstede insights, some of you might know, to look at wellbeing at work in the UK, how the pandemic has impacted, discuss what's next, and to think about our own wellbeing and how we can look after ourselves, because this is absolutely vital.
Layla, if you're having trouble moving, just click onto the actual image within Zoom. That should help.
Thank you. I don't know why it's not working. It was working when we tried it, wasn't it? So what do I mean when I talk about mental health? What I mean is the health of our mind, and everyone has mental health. Often mental health is used to talk about mental ill health, mental illness, diagnosis, but it is a person's condition in regards to their psychological and emotional well-being. And of course, it affects how we think, feel, and act. It also determines how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. And if our mental health is optimum, we're likely to make better choices because we can analyze things and look at things. If our mental health is particularly low, our judgment might be clouded and we might make choices that don't serve us in the long run. Of course, it impacts our self-esteem and how we see others. And it enables us to create, form, and sustain all the different types of relationships we have in our lives. So friends, with family, with colleagues, romantic relationship with pets, it really does span the whole plethora of that. So what's well-being then? I like to think of well-being as an umbrella, and well-being incorporates physical and mental health to create an overall picture of being well. And it's how you manage your day-to-day life and how you're feeling on a given day. So clearly mental well-being is a really key part of that. As I mentioned, mental well-being is how we manage ourselves, relationships, and participate in life in the way we may wish to. And well-being, of course, is influenced by the environment. There's so much to say with that. When people have troubles, if they have insecure housing, if they're in very difficult situations, of course, our well-being is going to be influenced by that. And it's likely to change. And I think most of us will have seen that during this time, whichever country that we've been in, this fluctuates so much because the environment has a huge part to play. And well-being isn't static because there are, of course, skills and behaviors that we can all adopt to improve our overall well-being. And this helps to manage our stress levels and develop resilience. And flourishing is not just the absence of stress and mental ill health, but it is about having that energy, passion, self-esteem, improved physical health, supportive relationships, and being successful in our endeavors. Or what I will say is, trying things and knowing that we might not be successful first time, but also giving ourselves the space to try things. Maybe it's not going to succeed the first time, but to have faith that we will be successful ultimately in those endeavors. And I wanted to mention the 5 different types of well-being, and this may be familiar to you. It was research conducted by Rath and Harter in 2010, and that they're different categories of well-being. And if we think of our umbrella, we've got physical and mental well-being, they do play into this as well. So first of all, career well-being, and this is not necessarily the way we may think of a traditional career. We go to school, we do well in our exams, we go to university, and then we get a career. It could be that, but it is also about how you occupy your time and simply enjoying what you do every day. Social well-being, and I think we've seen this pandemic's had a huge impact on that, is about having strong relationships and love in your life. And again, I want to be really clear, it's not just romantic love in a heteronormative fashion, but this is however we define love. So friendships, families, etc. So love in the widest way. Then financial well-being, effectively managing your economic life and being able to have enough to live in the way that you want to. Physical well-being is having good health and enough energy to get things done on a daily basis. And community well-being, and this for me is one of the most important things, is a sense of engagement you have with the area where you live. And I think universities, and particularly I'm sure this is the same for you, my time at Leeds absolutely gave me that sense of well-being, community well-being, and lifelong friends that of course I still have and speak to on a weekly basis. And then finally, emotional well-being. So emotional well-being is something that looks and feels different in different cultures. And it's not about the absence of emotion. It's not, and if I can use a particularly, I'm going to say English as opposed to UK, but that stiff upper lip, it's not about ignoring that, but it's about the ability to understand the values of emotions and harness them positively in the workplace, in our daily life, and to support others with their emotional well-being journey. Everyday emotional well-being involves identifying, building upon, and operating from our strengths, rather than fixating on problems and weaknesses. Of course, we need to think about development areas, but it's not fixating on those. And the more equipped we are to understand emotions, the greater our capacity to cope with that stress and focus on important priorities. And of course, this is going to change from culture to culture. The words that are used in different languages for emotions, how emotions are expressed, are going to be very different depending on culture. There are some universal ones, but also the way in which things are expressed. So an example that I can share with you is in UK workplaces, it's very rare that people will shout openly. That's seen as very rude, you lose face. In other cultures, people will shout openly, get it out there in the air and move on. So the difference there. And then I wanted to bring on, speaking of culture, and this may be familiar to some of you, is high and low context culture. So this is incredibly broad brushstroke, and but it can be a useful model, and it's based on the work of Edward T. Hall, who conducted research in the 50s and 60s. Now, this is very binary and it looks very black and white. And we know that culture is much more complex than this. But I do think it does play into well-being and how different countries and different communities are going to recover or need different recovery strategies depending on their cultural context. So high context cultures, these tend to be South Asia, Southeast Asia, Arab nations, South America, the continent of Africa. It's much more relational, collectivist, intuitive, contemplative, and less written formal information, and there's much more oral. So if we think about oral traditions and oral histories. And then low context cultures are global north, essentially, Western Europe, the USA, North America, Canada, Australia. Like I said, it's very broad brushstroke. The UK is in here as well. It's more about logical, linear. It's very much more about the individual, action orientated, and lives are very compartmentalized. So it's individuals that have individual relationships. It's much less collectivist, and language is often precise and just enough to get the message across. Now, this is a model. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it can help to understand as well how different countries have reacted to the pandemic and the approaches that they've taken. And then touching on Hofstede Insight, as I mentioned, if you're interested in this, I would say go onto the Hofstede website. There's actually a country comparison tool, which is really interesting, and it looks through these aspects. And you can type in, I think it's up to 3 countries, and look at the insights and how different countries compare. Again, this is very broad brushstroke. It is based, Hofstede is a Dutch organization. It was Dutch, so it is based from a Western lens, so we have to take that into account. But I think it's helpful to think about this. So the first thing is the aspect measured is power distance. So this is about power distribution, hierarchy, and how inequality is addressed. So interestingly, those lower context countries, the power distance is less. And if we look at China, Japan, South Korea, they have very high power distances. Then we have individualism versus collectivism. So how important communities are and how communities are going to play a part in recovery. Again, what do we see? We see those high context countries scoring very highly, where communities and collectivism is important, and the low context countries going lower. Masculinity versus femininity. Now, this isn't maybe what you might envisage, but it's an approach of tough. So we're going to be aggressive. We're going to have an aggressive stance, and we might have seen that very much in terms of, you know, immigration, who's coming in, who's coming out. We're not going to let people in. That would be a tough approach. Versus tender, which I would say for coronavirus, we've seen that very much with female leaders, Angela Merkel, and in Taiwan with a female leader, how they've managed the pandemic differently, and Jacinta Ardern, for example. Yeah, sorry, Megan, I'm just seeing that people can submit questions. Thank you. Then we've got uncertainty avoidance. So how comfortable countries are with ambiguity and controlling the future. Again, what do we see? High context countries are like to avoid uncertainty. So if we think about the approach that China took, absolutely want to avoid uncertainty, collectivism, lockdown straight away. Most Chinese citizens were saying, well, this is our contribution. We don't want people to get sick. And low context countries seem to be more fluid and more okay with ambiguity and not controlling the future. So versus Sweden's approach, for example. Then we've got long versus short-term orientation. So high context countries, again, are less likely to want to deviate and move from those cultures and those traditional cultures and norms. And short-term culture, again, low context culture, it's okay, we can move, we can shift, we can change the way things are done. And then finally, indulgence versus constraint, which I think has been interesting to see as we've started to open up in the UK. So this is really about, you can't be happy all the time, and that suffering and challenges are part of the daily life. And it makes me think about lots of Southeast Asian philosophers and that approach versus, let's have fun, gratification, self-help culture. You can be happy no matter what. So there's that side to it as well. And I thought it was important to mention that because I know we've got people from lots of different countries with us today and cultural backgrounds. So the challenge, emotional well-being has been pushed to the limit. There's been little separation between what is professional and personal life. So we're going to launch a poll now, and we'd really love to hear, anonymous poll, what's been the biggest challenge for you out of the things that you can see here on the poll? And we'll leave it open for a minute so that you can vote. Yeah, get your votes in. It's not going to be open for much longer. Got 30 more seconds. Okay, we're going to close the poll now and share those results with you. Okay, so the biggest one, not being able to see friends and family, of course. So if we think about that social well-being, that community engagement, that's been huge. I'm surprised not to see more in video call burnout. Crikey, that's really been one for me. Personal grief, disruption to routine, working at home overnight. So there's lots there, isn't there? But the biggest one, not being able to see friends and family. And I think this has been, particularly in the UK, people moving, people wanting to be closer to their family, their grandparents, people moving back home to be with their families. So it's been interesting. So thank you for doing that. Fascinating to see some of those results. And resilience then, I wanted to mention resilience. This is something that people talk about a lot. Well, the things that you've highlighted, you just need to be resilient. Well, life's not that simple, is it? And I like to think of resilience as not being able to suck it up, as it were, and put up with difficult situations, as in, it's strategies to think, how do I want to manage this, as opposed to just thinking I've got to put up with it. And how I like to look at it is resilience is a rubber band, and we all have a rubber band of a particular size and shape, and potentially color as well. And when we are challenged with those things that we listed in the poll, our rubber band gets pulled out of shape. And then what we need to do is think about how do we, what are the coping strategies or things we need to do to get that rubber band into the optimum shape and size for us, sometimes known as bounce back ability. And that's why I like to think of it as this internal rubber band. Again, it's not about avoiding things, it's not about pretending they're not there, but it is about sustainability and thinking about times where you've been through challenges, you've got through it before, how you can get through it again. And it applies to individuals, teams, organizations, and countries. And I think we're seeing that, and how it'll look different at different levels, but it applies throughout all levels. Mental ill health before the pandemic, essentially it's been there, it's been an issue. There was a great report by Farmer and Stevenson in 2017 called Thriving at Work. This was then refreshed by Deloitte in 2019. And you can see the figures there, that people had existing mental ill health, presenteeism, where people drag themselves into work where they're not feeling mentally optimum, and they can't function, it costs a lot more than if people take a sick day and take that time to recover. That for every £1 invested on workplace interventions on wellbeing, that could be training, that could be an employee assistance program, that could be supporting staff, that could be training line managers into how to have a positive conversation, that for every £1 invested, there's a return of at least £5, which is actually huge. And then I managed to find the most recent figures from the HSE, stands for Health and Safety Executive in the UK, declared sick days lost due to mental ill health. And as you can see, those numbers have gone up. And it's been an interesting one because 2019 they went down, 2018 they were slightly more, and this year it was 17.9 million days. And there was also an article saying that near a million people, it was over 800,000 people in the UK had really struggled with their mental health, having to work from home. And then just a little bit about managers. In essence, this is from 2019, this report. The most recent report does state that this has changed, that managers seem to be taking more of this on board to support their staff, but essentially that managers have had to put the interest of their organisation before well-being. 70% of managers say, there are real barriers for us to provide that mental health support, that employees, of course, experienced poor mental health before the pandemic, that often there are no changes when these things are reported, and only 11% of managers that responded to this survey had received training on understanding workplace stresses. So there's still a way to go. And I'm not saying that the pandemic has been positive at all, but I'm hoping that this will be further and further up the agenda as a result. Of course, there were wellbeing initiatives, and these are some of the things that I have seen working with a number of organisations. Often wellbeing means fitness to people, it means having a fruit bowl in the office. I would say wellbeing's a lot more than that. It's about building a structure that encourages mental wellness and physical wellness, and it's proactive rather than reactive. So these are some of the things I mentioned: gyms, fitness apps, employee assistance programs, peer buddying schemes, which I think are fantastic. So you have peers from the same level in an organisation that are trained to be buddies to people if they want to talk about anything. It's different to counselling. It could be about workplace stresses at a very proactive level, mental health first aid training, and this is available in 23 different countries, and it will be tailored for the country's medical provisions around mental health and well-being. Reclaim your lunch break, flexible working, agile working, meeting free days. Maybe some of you have those in your organizations, e.g. Focus Fridays, technology free days. I know some organizations would stop people using technology and they had to go around and see people face to face. Options to purchase private medical care, and of course in some countries that would be standard, and I've mentioned fruit bowls. So this was pre-pandemic. Then the pandemic comes along, and what's happening? So we've seen in the UK and other countries, the UN has said it's 25 years worth of gender equality has basically been wiped out in a matter of months. So around caring responsibilities, women are still pretty much globally the main carers for younger dependents and older dependents. We've seen race, ethnicity and nationality discrepancies with who COVID affects and how COVID affects people. And if you're from a country where potentially there aren't the same race discrepancies in the UK, this is all going to reflect itself in terms of income and poverty. Global majority, or BAME as you might know it, staff having to educate their peers following George Floyd's murder in June 2020. There have also been Asian hate incidences and shootings recently in the US. So all that labor, that emotional labor, goes on to those staff to have to educate their peers. Long COVID, we don't know what that really looks like yet. And in the sense that the long-term impacts, but there are thousands upon thousands of people who have COVID and they're not particularly well. They're not sick enough to be in hospital, but they're not well at all. And that lot of ongoing disability. And actually, we're not really prepared for that as a country. Financial inequity, how some people have done well in the sense that they've been able to save, they've been able to buy a house, and others, this has been absolutely catastrophic if we think about the hospitality sector, or people that have had to go to work if they work in factories, and that's absolutely happening in the UK. Changing use of space in offices, social distancing. Many people don't want to work at home. They want to go into the office. That's not been possible, or the office feels very different for them. Digital poverty, that's been incredibly difficult for many people. They can't just work from home, but thinking about education, that's been a huge one. So how do people get the support they need and access the learning materials when they're not able to, when they don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have the internet, they don't have any digital assets that work for them. Vaccine hesitancy, I wanted to mention, and not in a critical way, given the recent news about certain vaccines, maybe people are less willing to come forward for it, and how vaccine hesitancy is going to impact the workplace. What are the rules that organizations are going to have about that? Do you have to have a vaccine? We're having discussions here about vaccine passports. Pressure, we've talked about that. Increasing prevalence of mental ill health, as I mentioned, and lack of systemic support. I think workplaces are having to mop up a lot of that. And I think it needs to be more of a joint approach. Grief and the need to speak about death in the workplace. I'm not sure in the UK we're necessarily prepared for that. And then if we go back to our Hofstede insights and our high and low context cultures, that might feel very different in other countries where grief is spoken about more, where people feel more open to speak about death. That is going to have to shift, I think. People being furloughed on and off, 1 month on, 1 month off, being paid a certain amount, but that might also link in with financial inequity. Back pain from working in non-ergonomic environments. We've seen that people are really struggling with back pain, people working at their kitchen tables, and it makes you realize the workers' rights and the work that the unions have done to enable us to have great working environments and desks and chairs that we need. It really has brought that home. Returning to a physical workplace, are people ready? As I mentioned, some people really want to go back. Other people are feeling quite worried about it. Maybe they don't want to navigate the office politics. It's not easy being around people, even very social people like myself. I feel quite hesitant about it. Commuting on public transport, is that going to create anxiety? And ways in which we want to connect now, that's going to look different. And we still don't really know whether we're going to be completely out of lockdowns, because we don't know. Even with excellent modeling, no one has a crystal ball. So what's next then for wellbeing? I've mentioned all those things. Well, how can we support in workplaces this umbrella of wellbeing, physical and mental health? You can see in that background picture there people in a space doing yoga all together or meditation at work. I don't know if it's going to look like this. It's going to be interesting, or if it is going to look like this, I think it will take some time. So I think the first one is it is going to be country and culture dependent, what initiatives you have in place, what initiatives there are in place, and how countries are prioritizing this based on the different aspects that we've spoken about. I think there does need to be more research on the impacts through an intersectional lens. And what do I mean by this? So we talked about long COVID. It's thought that long COVID is impacting women more. There looks like at the moment, and I've got some friends who are researching this, the impact of COVID on menstruation, on fertility, on the menopause. There's huge research to be done. And then if we add in, you've got women, and then if we add in women of colour and global majority backgrounds, we could then add in women who have varying disabilities and how COVID might have impacted them. There's a lot of research to be done and lenses to look through that can then shape wellbeing initiatives at a national level, an individual level, and a workplace level. I think there's a big thing about accepting that it's going to be uncomfortable. If I mention things like talking about death, or people feeling potentially very anxious about commuting, it's not going to be necessarily a smooth transition. It's going to take time to go back, just like it took time to settle into the pattern we've had for over the last year. I do think positively that flexible and agile working is going to be standard. So in the UK, anyone has the right to request flexible working, but an employer can refuse flexible working on the basis of a business and business need. And agile working is working wherever you need to work, and that I think is going to be much more standard. And I'm hoping that flexible working, I know many organizations have come forward and saying actually we can trust our employees now, they've been doing a great job, in fact productivity has gone up, so hopefully we can see people having more access to flexible working. 4-day work week, whether that will happen in the UK I don't know, but New Zealand have been talking about this. Am I right? In Spain has been having discussions about this. And I think that's really going to help well-being and people transitioning back. I also think it's important to think about psychological risk assessments, and H&S is health and safety at home. So people are going to have a blended approach. We talked about back pain and mental health and well-being and how people want to connect. Having these risk assessments and these discussions is going to be vital. I think as well, there's going to have to be digital support, and it is there in some organisations, and therapy for bereavement with cultural elements. So different cultures grieve differently, as I mentioned. So therapy can't be one size fits all, or digital support. It has to take into account that need and those different cultural needs, and how people celebrate and remember people that have passed on. Training for managers, as I mentioned, to spot signs of mental ill health remotely. So this is something that's come to the fore. We did the training face to face, we'd have conversations, it was great. We could really talk about looking for the signs, and then things have shifted. It is very hard to spot signs online. It is possible, but it's much more difficult. How do we really read body language? That's one of the reasons that video calls are so exhausting. It's because we're trying to focus and we can't read body language in the same way. So that training is going to be crucial. I think we're going to see more financial well-being support, including debt management from the workplace. Now, if workplaces have employee assistance programs, that's normally standard, but I think there is going to have to be a stepping up of this. That word resilience, so building resilience at an organisational and an individual level. Thinking about how, as an organisation, what does our rubber band look like? What's pulled us out of kilter? Let's think about being proactive rather than reactive and making redundancies. What are the things we can do? Who would like to go down to a 4-day work week, 3-day work week? And what are the other things that we can do? Work-life balance to support that demarcation between home and life, difficult. And it needs to be under constant review, and not everyone's work-life balance will be 50-50. So thinking about that. We don't like uncertainty as humans, so creating clarity and communicating. I don't think we can make everything certain, but creating that environment for staff as much as possible through communication. Redundancy support and flexibility in career trajectories. So we might see more things like returners schemes for people that have been off with caring responsibilities, programs that transition people back. People maybe at age 60 want to be graphic designers. What's that flexibility? And they need to train for that. How are those measures going to be put in place? So I think that's a really, really important thing. And just acknowledgement of age and life stage, and that we have no default retirement age in the UK anymore. I mean, people still retire potentially around 67 to 75, but people can keep working. So what that looks like, that's going to be interesting. And I think having those conversations really is crucial. And you can see I've put my fruit in the background because it's got to be more than the proverbial fruit bowl. And I wanted to mention this great cutting edge research from the University of Leeds. So the University School of Law has been awarded 2.5 million from the UK Research and Innovation Fund to create, and when I mentioned intersectional research, this is what I meant, to create the consortium on practices for wellbeing and resilience in Black, Asian and minority ethnic families and communities. And it's led by the wonderful Professor Leila Okhai. And she says that we want to illustrate the way in which COVID-19 is exacerbating the experience of inequality for those in these communities. And so researchers are going to investigate the combined impact of COVID-19 and racial discrimination on wellbeing and resilience. So that word resilience again, in communities, aiming to create a fuller picture of the vulnerabilities of these communities. So I think that's really, really exciting. I think it's brilliant that Leeds are leading in this, and I really look forward to seeing what comes out of that. And Professor Solanke was also part of the SPI-B research looking at resilience in communities that were hard hit this time last year around COVID. So do have a look at her work. So, you know, it is about doing things differently. It might feel like we're going back to the beginning, challenge and renegotiating power in the workplace, what that's going to look like and feel like, setting boundaries for ourselves and with others. We're used to keeping space. So again, certain cultures, there is much less of a distance between people. People will gravitate towards each other. If we think about greetings, thinking about Spain in particular, Italy, how people greet each other, that is that going to change? Remembering what we do and don't have control over, and that everyone will have a different experience and triggers related to the pandemic. So to be mindful of that and not assume it's one size fits all. And of course, it's going to be gradual change. So for some individuals and organizations, there's this desperate need to get back to normal. I'm not sure that normal that we used to know is going to come back quickly. I think it's going to be interesting to see. Of course, I've mentioned this, there are countries who have done very well, and their COVID strategies. Taiwan, Senegal was a proactive one and one of elimination. The uncertainty, even though we have fantastic scientific modeling. And it's imperative to be aware of the well-being, the impact that it has on ourselves and as others. But as managers, leaders, friends, and family members, maybe we are having to process what this transition feels like going back. And adaptability and integration are vital, as we see in nature. So we're part of this system, and that gradual change is really important to be aware of. So thank you so much for listening. These are my details, which we will share with you at the end after the questions again. And I'd love to open it up to questions, and Phil's going to come back in to help me do that.
Thanks, Leila. That was fascinating. There may be more questions to come in, but we did get a few questions that were submitted by alumni before, so I want to pick up on those to kick off with. And I think the first one, you talked a bit about work-life balance, and I guess in lots of ways also you talked about to notice it.
Phil, your audio is quite bad. I know we had some issues with your headphones, but perhaps you could put those in for us if you don't mind.
Of course.
Thank you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's better. Okay. Thanks, Phil.
Right, we'll start that again. Yeah, I wanted to start with some questions that we've been submitted by alumni for today. And I wanted to go back firstly to talk a bit about work-life balance. And obviously the other thing you touched on is the kind of the division between professional and personal has in lots of ways collapsed a bit during the pandemic as well. But just generally, I just wondered if you could just say a little more about how some tips or how we should approach work-life balance in the best way.
Yeah, so work-life balance is an interesting one. And I think that one of the things I mentioned was that not everyone's work-life balance is 50-50. So not everyone wants a 50% working and 50% personal. Maybe it's 70% personal, 30% working. Maybe it's 60% working, 40% personal. So one of the things I would say is to consider that, and to think about where you want think of it as what a bar chart, one bar, and where you want your work-life balance to be. Then what I always say to people is think about where you spend your time. And what you might like to do is Laura Vanderker's I think is it 172 method. I hope the number's right, but essentially how many hours there are in a week. And if you have a look at her website, you can download some Excel spreadsheet templates, and you're just going to look at where you spend your time. And after a week, you'll have your overview, and then you can decide, okay, I want to do less of that, I want to do more of that, or where is my time going? So then you can start to establish, what do I need to do? Now, it's not always possible. Maybe you don't want to homeschool, but you have to. Maybe you don't want to do the house chores, but you have to. So there's some things that won't be movable, but there'll be other things that are movable. So I think it's about taking that time to decide what the split is. And then secondly, to think about where you're spending your time. And then thirdly, to say, okay, what could I eliminate, automate, or transfer? What's negotiable? What's non-negotiable?
Thank you. If we turn now to a question that's been raised today, that I think a lot of us are kind of asking about. So the uncertainty of the future, and you mentioned it, is a cause of concern for many people because it is such an uncertain situation that we're in. What techniques can we adopt to help us cope with this kind of level of uncertainty?
Sorry, can I just very quickly interrupt there? Phil, we're still having some audio difficulties with you. Would you mind leaving and coming back? And in the meantime, Leyla, if you'd like to answer that question, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Kathleen. So coping with the uncertainty, and how do we do that on an individual level? Because it's a concern for many. So what techniques can we what techniques do I suggest to help us? I think this is a really important question, but also a very tricky question. One of the things I would say is, yes, it's super important to know what's going on. I don't deny that. But we have to balance this with our well-being. And the more negative news we read, we will have the symptoms or the sensations in our body that we do with anxiety when we have to do something we don't particularly want to. So we might have that fight, flight, or freeze. So I would say one of the things is to decide what news sources you're going to look at, how long you're going to look at them for, and then to spend time counteracting that with positive news sources, looking at things that bring you joy. If it's cat videos, I know lots of people have been watching cat videos, if it's looking at positive news, so the actual website positive news, whatever it is, limiting your time for worrying. So one technique that people talk about is you set yourself 20 minutes at a particular time and you worry, and then you park that. And then to think about what's in your control and what's not in your control. So you can, and this is from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is not my technique, but you can draw 3 circles: what you have absolute control over, what you have some control over, what you have no control over. And you could fill those in and then decide, well, the things I have no control over, I'm just going to have to think of techniques of not concerning myself about that. Deciding, I can read the news, I want to be aware what I'm going to read, what I'm not going to read. And then the things you have absolute control over is the times that you can set to do particular activities. I would also say to find the calm in the chaos is to do things that you really love and enjoy. So things that distract you, things that can put you into that sense of flow. If it's reading a really good book, whether it's painting, whether it's doing DIY, whatever it is, those are the things I would say. And so thank you for the question. I think it is really difficult. But yes, I think those are some of the things I would suggest to cope with this on a personal level.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can hear me reasonably well. I think, as we said earlier, kind of technological challenges are one of the things that are additional barriers that we face at the moment. But I'm glad you can hear me. I want to pick up sort of following that another question in the Q&A. About burnout, and again you mentioned this earlier. So for people who are concerned about or even kind of facing but the prospect of reaching burnout in quarantine, what steps do you think we should take?
That's a really tough one. So around facing burnout in quarantine. So quarantine, and I know again certain countries are very, very strict. I've seen some friends in Hong Kong, they're not allowed to leave their hotel room. They have to have these COVID tests. It's quite a small room. It's really, really, really tough. So and I know you're not allowed out your room, you're not allowed out in the sunshine in certain cases. So I would say it's around setting a routine if you can. I realize there's not much you can do. And maybe that routine is a little, is better in the sense that could you have a lie-in? Could you do things? Could you make sure where possible that you're eating foods that nourish you, that help you? Thinking about reading you can do, some short, sharp exercises, some breathing exercises, some meditation. Now I realize that doesn't stop the stress of being confined in a particular area, but I think maybe setting that routine, feeling you've got some kind of purpose as well. So maybe reframing it to say, I'm in quarantine, so I'm protecting myself and other people. Coming up with maybe some phrases, some positivity phrases that can be useful to you during that time. Those are some of the things I would say, and I do appreciate that it's very, very difficult. And I think acknowledging that it's not easy, but I can do this, and ways in which you can reframe things, create routine, and create purpose.
Great, thank you. I want to take a couple of questions now from the audience that are both very different, but related to the employer to a certain extent. And I think the first one there. And this has been, I think, quite common, that that different people work in different ways. So some of us have faced challenges or additional challenges working from home. Others have also found that actually the kind of home working environment has been better for their mental and physical health than the kind of old office environment or the old workplace environment they might have been in before the pandemic. So actually there's a preference from those people to maintain that environment rather than a sense of kind of just going back to the office or wherever it is. But obviously there's the thing that people think, and I guess the thing that their employers, the view that employers have, and it may be the same, it may not all be the same. So the question in the chat is basically your advice for those people who have found this environment positive, how they can kind of broach that with their employers or their managers.
Yes, and I had a conversation about this yesterday, and someone said, I don't understand, like for me, it's been amazing working at home. I haven't had to manage politics. I think it's having that conversation with your manager. So you've seen what I've done over the last year. You've seen my productivity. I'd like to request agile working at home 90% of the time, because it's actually helpful for me. These are the benefits. I think you might have to sell the benefits to them. And also you have, if you're based in the UK, so I don't know where you're based, but you do have a right to request that, and you can say it's, if you, depending on your relationship with your line manager, but you can say, I feel it's been brilliant for my well-being. As a result, I've been more productive, so I'd like to request that I can continue to work from home because it seems you've been really happy with my work. If you can gather any testimonials while you've been working at home around how your work's been received, compliments, praises, I think that's something you could put together and present to your manager as well as part of the case. I mean, in an ideal world, I do understand we shouldn't have to do this, but given that that is the case, those are some of the things, because you want to show that you're solving a problem, that often managers, and I don't know what your manager's like, but they don't want to feel, oh God, something else on my plate. You want to say, right, here it is, done and dusted, I've got the evidence, I'm making your life easy, and it will benefit the organization in this way. If you've got a trade union rep, I would absolutely speak to your trade union rep. If you've got a staff network or support in your workplace, it might be another place to have that discussion as well. Someone you can practice the conversation with, I think that also really helps before you have the conversation with your manager.
Thank you. And a question, of a slightly different question regarding to the workplace. The question is, there's a lot of talk of well-being of employees by some organisations, but on practical grounds, they don't actually do much. Yeah. Can you say something about this and how to approach it?
Yeah, that's the fruit bowl, isn't it? That's like, we do well-being, here's our fruit bowl. We do well-being, here's our treadmill in the office. Yes, and I think so there are a couple of things here. I mean, I don't know, it might be, is there a space for you to have this conversation on a departmental or team level? And what do we all need for our well-being? So you can come at it from a place of, this is for all of us and it's going to benefit all of us in the team. It does need proper systemic change. I totally agree with you. And I'm wondering whether you've got if there are any stats that show sickness absence or statistics that show how the staff turnover, and you could say something like, this is quite concerning. I think we need to consider our well-being. Is there someone who does well-being in the organization that you could speak to? And just trying to be a little bit strategic about it. Could you be a rep? I don't know what your workload's like. I don't know where you work, but could you be a rep and say, oh, actually, I think we need a few reps on well-being to create some systemic change post-pandemic. There are things that we need to consider and think about. It's got to be more than what we're doing because we need to retain staff. So there might be quite a few angles that you can go through there, or ask the question. I don't know if the head of your organization has a Q&A time. You could ask that it's really, wellbeing is really important. So what are the company going to be doing going forward strategically? And my final point on that one is a competition. So if there are organizations that are similar to yours that are doing something really well, that's another really great thing to do. That, oh, look, so companies similar to ours are doing this, that, the other. Oh, I think it'd be really important. We're going to lose people. We want to look like we're the best in this area. What are we going to do? So yeah, that's what I would suggest.
And there's a question that's kind of the converse of that, actually, which is that many companies have wellness programs, but then employees don't always engage in them.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice on how to engage more employees in wellness programs where they do exist?
Yes, that's another big one. I know that often employee assistance programs are woefully underutilized. I think one of the barriers can be reassurance about confidentiality, that often people don't think they're confidential, or they think, well, this doesn't really benefit me. I've got my personal gym, or I don't really understand what it is. So it starts from the induction process, and it's got to be more than a leaflet. And I think it's raising those topics in team meetings, in one-to-ones, just reminding people, making sure they know the benefits, that it's easy to contact, getting any of those wellness programs in to talk about what they're doing. So a bit like we've had a webinar today, could they do a webinar? Could they do some engagement work? Could they have drop-ins? It can, I know it can be woefully underutilized. So I think sometimes people only go to those initiatives when they need help, when they're in a difficult situation. And it's how do we get people to do that proactively rather than reactively?
Yeah, thank you. And another question that's come up today, but kind of quite more generally, and I know we've touched a little on this as well, but about the fact that sometimes there's a sense that pressure and stress can be imposed by your manager or more higher up the organization. So have you got any general advice or ways for employee to handle with the sense of kind of too much pressure and too much stress that's kind of that feels like it's been imposed by management, and then can kind of lead into kind of a stressful situation?
Yeah, and so stress is really real, and it causes quite significant physical impacts, I think, as I can see this person has put in the Q&A. So please don't underestimate that. So the first thing is to recognize it in yourself and to draw that line and say, no, enough is enough. So can you have a conversation around what's reasonable in terms of workload? And if you can't have that conversation directly with your manager, I'm going to say trade union or a rep or some kind of advocacy support. Go back to your job description. What does it say in your job description? Are you doing way over and above? If so, then that job description needs to be revised and you need to be recompensed for that. What are the ways in which you can say no? Often one way is to say not yet, or to be really clear about the priorities. So to say, these are my priorities, this is what I'm focusing on. You now want me to focus on this. That's not going to be possible. You're going to have to choose. I also know that me saying that in an environment where I'm not speaking to a manager and I haven't got the emotions attached to it is very easy. Whereas, it's not necessarily easy when you're in that situation. Going back to the support that you can get, I would say if you need to speak to a GP or a medical practitioner and maybe take some time off to get signed off with stress, because it sounds like it's quite serious, then do take that. I think that's important, and it does send out a signal instead of to keep putting it on yourself, because what you don't want is to end up with long-term ill health, mental or physical, as a result of the workplace. And actually workplaces do have a duty. So what you might like to do is look on the Health and Safety Executive if you're based in the UK. There's stress management standards, they're excellent. So there's 6 things that employers should do around stress management competencies. You can also download a checklist there and have a look and see what your employer is doing well and what they're doing badly, and say, oh, well, I've had a look and I think there are things that could be done to help myself and team members. And if you can't have that conversation directly, is there an advocacy support? Is there someone that could help you to do that?
Great, thank you. And a really good question now that follows directly onto that from a management point of view, which says, as a manager who is now only in virtual contact with their team, what markers should they look out for as points of concern?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the things, if you're having video calls, is if someone is switching their video off consistently, they're very rarely coming on. When they do come on, if they look particularly, and again, it's hard to tell, but they might look disheveled, they might look particularly exhausted. If they don't want to talk on a video call, asking them if they want to speak over the phone. You might also have someone who's very disengaged. They may never contribute. They might be turning up to online meetings late. They might be avoiding one-to-ones with you. They might not say very much. And I would say it's to take a pause and say to them, okay, what's going on for you? How are you? And then they go, fine. And you go, how are you? And you can ask twice and start to have those conversations. There might be memory loss. Their work might not be quite up to scratch, or they might be working very long hours and late hours and sending emails at strange times you wouldn't expect for them. Essentially any kind of change in behavior, and the change in behavior might not be to do with work, but I would always say have that time then to ask twice, that how are you twice, and to engage with them and try and have a discussion. And it might be that they don't tell you very much the first time, so be prepared to rinse and repeat. So change in behavior, withdrawal, potential memory loss, disengagement, or there could also potentially be hyperactivity as well at certain times with a crash.
Thank you. And I want to follow that with a question that came in earlier, which sort of broadens that out more generally from beyond management, which is more generally, are there, given the situation, how do we more broadly look after each other?
Yes, so we all have a responsibility to look after each other, don't we? And whether that's in the home, in the street, with colleagues. I think the key thing is to ask people how they are, to make time for people to really listen to what they say. Listening is incredibly powerful. We often underestimate that. We might not be able to change things for someone, but if we can just sit back and not jump in and give advice and give people space to talk, that's very powerful. And then decide, help them, listen to them, and they can then come up with a solution for themselves. I think it's also really helpful to have a couple of numbers or support lines on your person at all times in case you need to refer people. So in many countries there's the Samaritans, or there's maybe a community group or anything at all that you can refer people to for support. Not all of us are counsellors. I'm not a trained counsellor and I wouldn't want to be actually, but it's about that listening and referral and that kindness. Never underestimate the kindness of just pausing and making time for someone, because they will remember that. And going back to that point about collectivist culture, we need to look after ourselves, and the concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, you are because I am, I think is always a really important thing to think about.
Thank you. So I've got a few more questions I can think about sort of mental health generally, and then we'll move on. We've got a few questions around kind of the situation now, both kind of during and what the future after the pandemic might look like. But first, I think to sort of the next question that's kind of come in links to what you just said, which is, even when we have listening management and support in place, sometimes, I guess I'm kind of reading into it, the tendency can be to respond to when people are desperate for help rather than kind of being more proactive generally. So what else should we be doing now just generally to support and improve mental health kind of proactively?
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing. So I think that I think so I'm just trying to read the question again. Listening management, what else? Yeah, I think it's about this. So I think from a workplace level, it's, why does everything have to be done yesterday? So from a systemic level, it's okay. Why is there always a rush? Also, why is there always one right way to do things? And giving people that autonomy and freedom to do things in different ways. Managing boundaries with different suppliers, clients, client-facing organizations, can be very stressful. And also encouraging people to think about what's going to work for them. Reclaim your lunch break can sound very basic, and in some countries, I remember talking to someone French about this and they thought it was ridiculous because everyone does take a lunch break. But in the UK, we don't, and how much of a difference that can make. I think one of the things can be really useful is a wellness action plan. And lots of organizations that do mental health work have one for everyone. So it's not just about mental illness. And essentially what it is your job, what you do when you're mentally optimum, the things that you want to do to keep yourself mentally optimum, what your trigger points are. If you start to become triggered by anything or become unwell, again, what your coping mechanisms are, who do you want to be told, how you want them to be told. And everyone can have one, and you can have it as light touch as you want. And what happens there is then everyone is being proactive about it, everyone's thinking about their mental health and well-being, and if something does go awry, there's less stigma and shame in it because everyone has a plan. So I think that that's a way to do it. And it's also, going back to the previous question, a way to encourage people to use the resources available to them in organizations. So I think that that's one thing. What can we be doing now to support it is a wellness action plan. It could just be a couple of questions. So what do you like to do? How do you like to take breaks? What helps your well-being? And what do you do to really switch off? And how often will you commit to doing that? And again, at team meetings, you could touch base on that. Who's going to talk about what they've done from their wellness action plan? So it makes it part of the everyday.
Thank you. I want to come to a specific question that came in slightly earlier. The question is, what can we do to support people suffering racial trauma? And obviously in your presentation, you talked a bit about how one of the impacts of the pandemic has been, to add an extra challenges and extra pressure in terms of some of those kinds of issues. So can you say a bit more about what can be done to support people in that situation?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I'm talking from the UK perspective here, is that we're quite uneasy and unsure of talking about race. Now, we don't want to jump down people's throats, and maybe some people don't want to talk about it in the workplace. Obviously, the verdict of the trial came in. It's good news in some senses, of course, but it's also very tragic that trial had to happen in the first place. We've seen 2 recent shootings. We've seen the race disparity report in the UK, which has been incredibly traumatic for people. I think, again, it goes back to that we can ask people, we can say, how are you? Would you like to talk about it? If someone says no, you say, okay, well, whenever you're here to talk about it, I'm here to listen. I think it's also about having not just training on race equality, but to really embed it. And, these are topical issues that affect people's day to day. So how are we talking about it at a systemic level to say, right, the race disparity reports come out, as an organization, we are going to ignore it, or we're going to address certain bits, so we're going to carry on with our race equality strategy because actually we don't really think the research was robust, and we're here to support people. I think it's really key that we don't ask people to dredge things up and to say to them, oh, okay, so this is traumatic, like, has that happened to you? But it's about saying, you know what, I'm really sorry to hear that. I am here to listen, and I want to be here for you. And is there anything you'd like me to do when you do want to speak to me? And acknowledging it and not diminishing it, and not saying, you know what, I don't think they meant it like that, because that often happens. People have a gut reaction because they feel discomfort. Oh, I don't think they meant it like that. And that's actually one of the most unhelpful things you can do. And I think by saying, you know what, I find it really upsetting, and I'm so sorry that this has happened. I find it really, I mean, I wouldn't start a conversation like this, but I think to reflect on it yourself and say, I find this really, really uncomfortable. But if I was struggling like that, I'd want someone to support me. And also make sure that you have culturally competent options if someone wants to seek counselling within your EAP. I always talk about the Black, Asian and African Therapy Network, BATIN. You can refer people to that. So cultural specific support as well. I think it's acknowledging it, not diminishing it, listening, and being mindful of what culturally appropriate support services are available.
Thank you. A question now, another question related to uncertainty. So the question on the Q&A is, I'm uncertain about what I want to do in the future. I'm currently unemployed and searching for a job either in my home country or abroad, but due to COVID, I'm very uncertain about whether I want to move now or not. So any tips for that sort of uncertain situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a really tough one, isn't it? Moving is a huge one. I would say, so this is purely personal, and I would say that it's really important to be led by your intuition and your gut, and that's very much how I make decisions, although you may be more logic. I think it would be about go for the jobs that appeal to you, go for things that really appeal to you and play to your skills, whether they're in your home country or abroad, and see what the support's available. So if you do get that job, you can then ask those questions around moving, around what support's available, around what the social situation would be like, how you could build that community. Because remember, interview is a two-way process, and it's really important that you get a chance to ask those questions, to answer your questions, so that you can make a decision about whether you want to move now or not. And I would be led by the job and the organization and the approach and the opportunities. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but that's kind of my tips in the way I would see it.
Thank you. So I want to ask one more kind of question that came in earlier, sort of generally about well-being, and then we'll finish. We've got a couple more questions in the Q&A, and we'll wrap up with those. But before I do those, so the question that kind of came in really was more generally about how can you kind of navigate that kind of the socialization aspect of the workplace, but also kind of keeping your own space, bearing in mind that different people respond to different get energy from different areas, but it's kind of quite a balancing act sometimes between those two things.
Yes, it is, isn't it? And I think one of the things is we'll have to see what it's like when we go back, how we feel. I think I know in the UK, when certain companies went back, there was red tape on the floor. People couldn't get very close to each other. And health and safety was taken seriously in many organizations, in most organizations. So I would say that's one thing. And I would say just be easy on yourself, and it's going to take time. And if it feels weird and it feels uncomfortable, sit with the discomfort in the sense that not sit with the discomfort and deal with it, but just thinking, okay, I feel uncomfortable. What can I do about it? What questions could I ask? What could I do to make myself feel more comfortable? Could I ask about working from home if this feels really weird to me? So yeah, a few things there, and I hope that's helpful.
Right, thank you. Then a couple of questions to wrap up with. I think that the first one I want to pick up from Q&A, which says the young ask, will it always be like this? So I think, the question from your point of view, from someone who looks at well-being in the workplace, as we're seeing this kind of potential scenario of kind of managing COVID and vaccination, kind of constant testing, from a workplace sort of well-being point of view, do you think that's a kind of, will it always be like this, or is that a sustainable kind of approach?
It's a great question, and I'm sure some of our scientists and researchers could answer that much better than me. Yeah, I mean, that's my point about vaccine hesitancy, and I understand why there's vaccine hesitancy. So in this country, it's not going to be mandatory. That's going to be interesting. The constant testing. I know that for school children, for pupils, those tests they have to do 2 or 3 times a week, aren't there? I don't know how sustainable it is. It's a really great question, and I think about the little bit of reading I've done around the Spanish flu, and that was different, but again, similar in the sense that the distancing, the contagiousness of it, it was a different virus. It's H1N1, wasn't it? An H1N1 variant. But yeah, I mean, I'm not that young, and I keep asking, will it always be like this, to be honest? I don't know how sustainable it is. We don't know about the variants. We don't know how that's going to impact on the vaccine rollout. I guess it has to be sustainable for now, in the fact that that's all we have. But yes, I wish I knew, and I would say have a look at some of the research that Leeds is doing in other areas. I know Imperial College is doing a lot on that as well.
Thank you. And the final question for today, because I thought it was a really great question to end with, should we or how can we see the current situation as an opportunity for progress rather than reverse?
Yes, I mean, that's also really good. And I am a bit of a glass half full person, so that's a very fair question to ask me. So I think, I feel like it could have, I think it could be progress if there wasn't so much greed involved in sometimes in some of it. I think that the progress we've seen with technology, I think the progress that we've seen with people using things like this, and potentially there is progress, isn't there, in saving air miles and saving petrol and saving fumes. There is potentially that, although I know that this does emit carbon as well, being online and sending emails. I think it could be an element for progress if we had more of a collectivist mindset in the global north. I think the challenge for me when I think about this is that systems were quite paper thin, and so the pandemic has exacerbated that. If we think about affordable housing, if we think about digital poverty, all of those things. So I think it could be an opportunity for progress if we had the structures in place and everyone was in the same vein of thought. I think the challenge for me is that it doesn't really feel like that, because there are always people who are disaster, what is it called? Not disaster economists, but people that kind of profit from a disaster. So it feels a little bit uncomfortable for me. But if it's in the right vein, yes, there could be. But yeah, perhaps I'm just not positive enough to whoever's said that. But I think it's helpful to think about that. It goes back to my point about reframing and resilience, doesn't it? So thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a talking a little about what the future might look like is a great place to end today. So I just want to say a huge thank you on behalf of the university and our alumni community for your time today, Leila. That was really, really fascinating and incredibly timely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone, and take care. So hopefully see you on something soon.
So that concludes today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today. When this webinar ends, you will get a feedback form. We'd be really appreciative if you would just take a few minutes, as a really short one, just to complete the form, because it really helps us to assess our events program and to plan future activity for you as well. So please do that when you leave. But apart from that, I'd just like to thank you for joining us today. Have a good day or evening, and hope to see you soon. Take care. Thank you.